My wife's attorney made one mistake. He assumed that a man who smells like smoke and drives a 12-year-old pickup and has never once worn a suit to a meeting has nothing worth fighting for. That assumption cost him 11 months and a settlement he did not see coming. I want to be clear about something before I tell you the rest of this. I am not a complicated man. I wake up early, I do the job, I come home. What I am is patient in a way that most people never have to be, because patience is not a virtue in my profession. It is a survival skill. You learn it the first time you walk into a burning building and have to slow your breathing down while everything around you is moving fast. You carry that with you, everywhere. My name is Joe Callahan. I'm 43 years old. I've been with Station 14 in Columbus, Ohio for 19 years, lieutenant for the last 6. I grew up in the same neighborhood where I work, which means I have pulled people out of houses I played in as a kid, and I have stood on sidewalks watching buildings burn that I remember when they were new. That does something to you. Not in a broken way, in a grounding way. It reminds you what actually matters and what doesn't. My father was a firefighter, his father before him. My daughter is 21 years old and studying emergency medicine, and I have never once told her to choose a different path because this is the kind of work that means something, and meaning something is not nothing. It is, in fact, everything. I met Diane in 2005 at a department fundraiser. She was a paralegal at a civil litigation firm, sharp, quick, the kind of person who read contracts the way other people read menus, fast and with complete retention. We married in 2007, bought a house in the neighborhood where I grew up, 3 blocks from Station 14, which Diane found either charming or inconvenient depending on the year. For the first 8 years, it was a good marriage. Then her firm promoted her to office manager and her circle changed, and somewhere in that change, I became something she had difficulty explaining at dinner parties. My husband is a firefighter, said with a smile that worked hard to stay in place. His name was Richard. He was a senior partner at a competing law firm, 50 years old, recently separated, the kind of man who had strong opinions about wine, and said things like, at the end of the day, in meetings, and meant them seriously. Diane had met him at a bar association event. I found out about it the way I find out about most things. Not through confrontation, but through observation. A name mentioned once and then carefully, never again. A changed schedule. The particular way a person stops being curious about your days. I did not say anything for 3 months. Not because I was afraid of the conversation. Because I was watching. 19 years of emergency work teaches you that the worst thing you can do when you don't yet understand the full situation is act on incomplete information. You wait. You gather. You understand what you're actually dealing with before you move. What I was actually dealing with turned out to be more than I initially understood. The divorce filing arrived on a Thursday. Diane's attorney was a man named Mitchell Crane, mid-50s, tailored suits, the kind of lawyer who charges $400 an hour and makes sure you know it from the moment you sit down. The initial financial disclosure was thorough in the way that aggressive filings are thorough, accurate on everything visible, structured to make my position look as limited as possible. Firefighter's salary, pension, half the equity in the house, the picture of a man who worked hard and built modestly and had nothing complicated to protect. Mitchell Crane had not done his homework. I called my attorney the following morning. Her name was Carol Webb, and she had been recommended to me by my union rep, who described her as someone who did not enjoy losing and had arranged her professional life to avoid it. Carol was 56 years old, drove an older car than mine, and had the specific quality of a person who asks questions that seem simple and are not. We sat down and she asked me to tell her everything about my financial situation. I told her about the salary, the pension, the house, and then I told her about the building. In 2011, my Uncle Frank passed away. Frank Callahan was my father's older brother, a contractor who had spent 40 years building and buying and renovating properties in the east side of Columbus. He had no children. He had a niece in Arizona who had not spoken to him in 15 years over a dispute I was never fully told the details of. And he had me. I had spent summers as a teenager working his job sites, carrying lumber, learning how things were built from the ground up. When he died, he left me a commercial building on Morrison Avenue. 3 stories, mixed use, retail on the ground floor, 4 residential units above. Built in 1961, renovated twice, structurally solid in the way that buildings built by people who knew what they were doing tend to be solid. I had not told Diane about the building. Not deliberately. Not as strategy. It simply had not come up in the way that things sometimes don't come up in a marriage where two people have been gradually becoming less interested in the details of each other's lives. Carol asked me when the inheritance had occurred. I told her. She asked whether Diane had ever been listed on the deed, ever contributed financially to the property's maintenance, ever been formally associated with the asset in any documented way. No to all three. Carol made a note and looked at me over her reading glasses. She had the expression of someone who has just found what she was looking for. The building had been appraised 18 months prior for insurance purposes. The number was $610,000. Columbus Real Estate had moved since then. Carol suggested a current independent appraisal. The current number came back at $740,000. Mitchell Crane received our financial disclosure on a Tuesday. I was told by Carol, who had it from a colleague familiar with Crane's office, that there was an unscheduled gap in his afternoon calendar that day that had not been there in the morning. Diane called me that evening. I answered because I had been expecting it. "Joe," she said, "why didn't you tell me about the building?" I thought about that question, about the years, about the way we had stopped asking each other things, about the particular silence that grows in a marriage when two people have stopped being curious. "It didn't seem relevant," I said. "The way you never mentioned Richard." A long silence. Her attorney filed an amended petition the following week claiming the building should be considered a marital asset on the grounds that the marriage had overlapped significantly with the period of ownership and that Diane had contributed indirectly through her domestic role during those years. Carol read me this argument over the phone with the tone of a person describing weather they have seen before. What Mitchell Crane had not anticipated was the documentation. My Uncle Frank had been meticulous in the way that contractors who have spent 40 years dealing with permits and inspections tend to be meticulous. The chain of title was clean. The inheritance documentation was complete. The property had been maintained entirely through rental income and a small business account in my name alone. There was no thread anywhere that connected Diane to the asset in any financial or legal sense. Carol used the word separate 17 times across 3 filings. She was not being repetitive. She was being precise. The negotiation took 11 months. Mitchell Crane was thorough, and Carol was more thorough, and eventually the amended position was withdrawn, and the settlement was structured around what could actually be argued rather than what Crane had initially hoped could be implied. Diane kept the house. She had wanted it from the beginning, and it was the right outcome. She had built her life around that neighborhood in a way I no longer had. I kept the building on Morrison Avenue, and the pension and a rental income stream that Mitchell Crane had spent 11 months trying to characterize as something other than what it was. I moved into the ground floor retail space for 6 weeks while I found an apartment. It was not comfortable. It was practical. The building's tenants knew who I was. I had been their landlord for 12 years. And Mrs. Kowalski on the second floor left food outside my temporary door twice a week without saying anything about it, which is the East Columbus version of grace. I found an apartment 8 blocks from Station 14. Small, quiet, mine entirely. I kept a photo of my Uncle Frank on the kitchen wall, a job site photo from 1980-something Frank in a hard hat, looking at something off camera with the focused expression of a man who is building something and knows it. My daughter called me the week the settlement finalized. She asked if I was okay. I told her I was fine. She said, "Dad, you know you could have told me it was hard." "I know," I said. "It was hard." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Uncle Frank would have been mad that you didn't fight harder for the house." I thought about that. "I don't think so," I said. "I think Frank would have understood that some things you hold and some things you let go, and the skill is knowing which is which." My captain at Station 14 is a man named Darius Webb. No relation to Carol, just a coincidence that amused us both when it came up. Darius has been with the department for 27 years and communicates primarily through eyebrows, which is a language I have become fluent in. The morning I came back after the settlement finalized, he looked at me across the apparatus floor and raised one eyebrow approximately 2 millimeters. "You good?" he said. "Yeah," I said. He nodded. "Good," he said. "We've got a training drill at 0800. That was the entirety of the conversation, and it was exactly right. Someone asked me recently whether I was angry. At Diane, at Richard, at Mitchell Crane, and his $400 an hour confidence. I thought about my Uncle Frank leaving me a building I didn't ask for. About Mrs. Kowalski leaving food outside a door without being asked. About Darius and his 2mm eyebrow raise. About my daughter studying emergency medicine because meaning something is not nothing. No, I said. I'm not angry. I just know what's worth holding and what isn't.